The first tremor shook the ground beneath Master Liu Wei's feet as he practiced his morning forms in the courtyard of the Celestial Dragon Temple. The ancient stones, worn smooth by centuries of devoted feet, cracked with spiderweb patterns that spread outward like lightning frozen in stone. Birds erupted from the surrounding forest in panicked clouds, their cries echoing across the mountain peaks that had sheltered this sacred place for over 1,000 years. Liu Wei paused mid-movement, his weathered hands still positioned in the tiger's claw stance. At 63, he had felt many earthquakes in these mountains, but this one carried something different. Something wrong. The tremor didn't come from the earth's natural shifting, but from something vast stirring beneath it, something that had been sleeping far too long. The other monks emerged from the temple halls, their orange robes bright against the gray morning mist. Young Brother Chen approached with wide eyes, his usual calm shattered by the unnatural rumbling that continued to pulse through the ground like a massive heartbeat. Master Liu, what is happening? The meditation hall's floor stones are splitting, and the ancient texts in the library are falling from their shelves. Before Liu Wei could answer, the mountain itself seemed to scream. A sound unlike anything in the natural world tore through the air, part roar, part grinding stone, part something else entirely. The sound of hunger that had been denied for millennia. Liu Wei's training kicked in immediately. His grandfather had told him stories, legends he had dismissed as folklore meant to teach respect for the old ways. Stories of the titan beasts that once roamed the earth before human civilization, creatures so massive and powerful that the first masters of martial arts had developed their techniques specifically to combat them. The founders of Kung Fu had not learned to fight other humans, but monsters that could crush cities with a single step. All monks to the inner sanctum, Liu Wei commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of training and leadership. Seal the temple doors and begin the ancient protective chants. Do not leave the sacred grounds under any circumstances. The ground buckled again, this time with such force that several of the younger monks stumbled. Dust rained down from the temple's curved roof as something massive moved beneath the earth, something that dwarfed even the mountain itself. Liu Wei rushed to his private chambers, his hands trembling not with age but with the weight of responsibility. From a hidden compartment behind his meditation altar, he withdrew an ancient scroll wrapped in silk that had turned yellow with age, the testament of the first masters, written by the founders of the celestial dragon style over 2,000 years ago. As he unrolled the delicate parchment, symbols and diagrams revealed themselves. Not just fighting techniques but warnings, detailed descriptions of creatures that modern science would call impossible. The scroll spoke of the Great Sealing, when the first masters had worked together to bind the titan beasts in chambers deep beneath the earth's crust, using techniques that combined martial arts with forces beyond normal understanding. The seals were breaking. Liu Wei's finger traced the ancient text as he read about the iron-hide Goratha, a creature the size of a city block with skin harder than steel and strength that could topple mountains, about the venom serpent Yes, whose poison could kill every living thing within miles and whose length stretched beyond the horizon, about the sky terror Krex whose wings could create hurricanes and whose talons could slice through anything made by human hands. Another tremor shook the temple, and this time Liu Wei heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of cracking stone, but not from any earthquake. This was the sound of ancient seals finally giving way after holding for 2 millennia. From his window, Liu Wei could see the horizon changing. What had been empty sky now showed a dark line rising, growing larger with each passing moment. At first it looked like a mountain emerging from the earth, but mountains didn't have eyes that glowed red in the morning light. Mountains didn't have claws that raked gouges in the landscape as they pulled themselves free from their underground prisons. The iron-hide Goratha was awakening. Liu Wei closed his eyes and centered himself, feeling the flow of qi through his meridians just as his masters had taught him 60 years ago. He thought of his grandfather's stories, no longer legends but urgent instructions for a battle that was about to begin. The old man had always emphasized that Kung Fu was not just physical technique, but a way of harmonizing with the forces of the universe itself. When he opened his eyes, Liu Wei's gaze had changed. Gone was the peaceful temple master who had spent decades in meditation and teaching. In his place stood something his students had never seen, a warrior awakening to his true purpose. The Goratha's roar split the morning air again, and this time it was joined by answering calls from across the mountain range. The seals weren't just failing in one location. They were breaking everywhere, releasing horrors that had been locked away since before recorded history. Liu Wei began to strip away his simple monk's robes, revealing a body that defied his apparent age. Decades of internal energy cultivation had preserved him, and muscles that looked weathered but not weak moved with fluid precision as he reached for items that had been stored away for years. From another hidden compartment, he drew out clothing he had hoped never to wear again, black fabric that seemed to absorb light, reinforced with threads of metal so fine they were nearly invisible, combat gear designed by masters who had faced the unthinkable and lived to perfect their techniques. As he dressed, Liu Wei's movements became a meditation in themselves. Each piece of equipment was positioned exactly where it needed to be, each weapon secured where it could be drawn without thought. This was preparation for a battle that would determine whether humanity survived the next few days. The Goratha's massive form was now fully visible above the tree line, its bulk blocking out a significant portion of the sky. Other shapes were moving in the distance, the awakening titans beginning to spread across the landscape like a plague of living destruction. Liu Wei picked up the ancient scroll one final time, memorizing the combat forms that had been developed specifically for fighting opponents whose size made normal martial arts useless, techniques that required not just physical skill, but the ability to channel natural forces through the human body. The last son of the celestial dragon temple stepped out into a world that was about to remember why humanity's ancestors had needed heroes in the first place. Liu Wei descended the mountain path with movements that seemed to defy gravity itself. Each step carried him farther than should have been possible, his body flowing like water around obstacles while maintaining perfect balance on slopes that would challenge experienced climbers. The ancient technique of celestial movement had been designed for exactly this purpose, covering vast distances quickly when facing enemies too large for conventional battlefield tactics. Behind him, the Goratha's footsteps shook the entire mountain range. Each massive step created landslides and sent shockwaves through the earth that Liu Wei could feel in his bones. The creature was moving toward the nearest human settlement, the city of Tianshan with its 3 million inhabitants who had no idea what was bearing down on them. As Liu Wei reached the base of the mountain, he could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding. The Goratha wasn't alone. In the eastern sky, something serpentine writhed through the clouds, its scales catching the sunlight like polished armor. The venom serpent Yus had taken to the air, its length seemingly endless as coil after coil emerged from underground caverns that had hidden it for millennia. To the south, trees were falling in perfect lines that stretched to the horizon, marking the path of something moving too fast to see clearly. Liu Wei recognized the pattern from the ancient texts, the blade wolf Fenrak, whose speed made it nearly impossible to track and whose claws could slice through solid stone as easily as silk. Liu Wei's enhanced senses, sharpened by decades of key cultivation, picked up radio transmissions from the nearby military base. Fragments of panicked communications filled the air as soldiers tried to make sense of what their instruments were telling them. Command, we're reading seismic activity unlike anything in recorded history. Multiple massive objects moving at impossible speeds. Air defense is tracking something in the sky over Sector 7. It's huge, sir. Radar says it's over 2 kilometers long. Ground units are requesting immediate evacuation assistance. Sir, we have civilians reporting monsters. Real monsters. Liu Wei's expression remained calm, but inside he felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. The military's weapons might slow the Titan beasts, but they wouldn't stop them. Modern humanity had forgotten the old knowledge, the understanding that some threats required more than technology to defeat. The first refugee vehicles appeared on the mountain road, families fleeing Tianshan as news of the approaching Goratha spread through social media and emergency broadcasts. Liu Wei positioned himself at a crossroads where he could intercept some of the evacuation traffic. A military convoy approached, its vehicles loaded with soldiers whose faces showed the strain of trying to process the impossible. Liu Wei stepped into the road and something in his bearing made the lead vehicle stop, despite the urgency of their mission. Colonel Zhang emerged from the command vehicle, his uniform crisp despite the chaos of the morning. He looked at Liu Wei with the skeptical expression of a career soldier, faced with what appeared to be an elderly monk, blocking a critical evacuation route. Sir, you need to clear the road. We have a massive seismic event heading toward the city, and we need to establish a defensive perimeter. Liu Wei studied the colonel's face, seeing dedication and courage, but also the limitation of someone trying to fight an unprecedented threat with conventional thinking. Colonel Zhang, your weapons will not stop what is coming. The creatures heading toward your city are older than human civilization, and they have survived every attempt to destroy them. The colonel's expression shifted from skepticism to irritation. Look, I respect your religious beliefs, but we're dealing with a real emergency here. Whatever geological phenomenon is causing these readings, we have procedures to handle it. Before Liu Wei could respond, the Garatha's roar echoed across the valley, so loud it rattled the windows of the military vehicles and sent birds fleeing from trees miles away. The soldiers instinctively reached for their weapons, though they had no target to aim at. Geological phenomenon, Liu Wei repeated quietly. Colonel, look toward the city. Zhang turned and raised his binoculars. Through the lenses, he saw something that made his hands shake. The Garatha had crested the final ridge before Tianshan, and its full size was now visible. The creature stood nearly 400 feet tall, its iron-colored hide scarred from ancient battles, its massive arms ending in claws that gleamed like polished metal. Each step created craters in the earth, and its eyes burned with an intelligence that was clearly not animal. My God, Zhang whispered. What is that thing? Your ancestors called it the Ironhide Garatha, Liu Wei said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. 2,000 years ago, my predecessors fought creatures like this and found a way to imprison them. Those seals have now failed, and the old knowledge is needed again. Zhang lowered his binoculars, his military training warring with the evidence of his own senses. Even if I believe that, what could one man do against something like that? Liu Wei's response was to demonstrate. Moving so quickly he seemed to blur. He leaped onto the hood of the nearest military vehicle, then to its roof, then into the air in a display of movement that defied normal human limitations. He landed 20 feet away in a perfect fighting stance, having covered the distance in a heartbeat. The soldiers stared in stunned silence. What they had just witnessed was impossible, according to everything they knew about human physiology, yet they had all seen it clearly. The martial arts your people know are descended from techniques developed to fight the Titan beasts, Liu Wei explained as he approached the colonel again. Moving normally now. Over the centuries, humans forgot the original purpose and began using these skills against each other. But some of us have preserved the true knowledge. Colonel Zhang's radio crackled with increasingly frantic reports. Fighter jets had been scrambled to intercept the venom serpent, only to discover that conventional missiles seemed to bounce harmlessly off its scales. Tank divisions moving to establish a perimeter around Tianshan were reporting equipment failures as the Garatha's approach created electromagnetic disturbances unlike anything. In their technical manual, sir, came a voice over the radio. We're getting reports of a third contact moving at incredible speed from the south. Ground radar is having trouble maintaining lock. Whatever it is, it's faster than anything we've ever tracked. Liu Wei nodded grimly. The Blade Wolf Fenrak. Colonel, your evacuation procedures are correct, but incomplete. You need to guide people not just away from the creatures, but to specific locations where the old protective wards still function. Zhang stared at this elderly man who spoke of ancient monsters and mystical protections as if they were established military doctrine. Everything in his training told him this was impossible. But the evidence of the approaching Garatha made it clear that his understanding of the possible had been severely limited. Tell me what you need, Zhang said finally, making the decision that would save thousands of lives. Liu Wei smiled for the first time that day, seeing in the colonel's face the same courage that had driven heroes in ages past. I need your people to trust techniques they don't understand, and guide civilians to places that aren't on any modern map. And I need you to keep your heavy weapons units alive long enough for me to reach the Garatha. Reach it? Zhang's voice rose. You plan to fight that thing directly? Liu Wei was already moving toward the approaching creature, his form seeming to flow across the landscape with inhuman grace. His voice carried back on the wind, clear despite the distance. Colonel, some battles can only be won by those who understand what they're truly fighting. Liu Wei reached the outskirts of Tianshan as the first military engagement began. Fighter jets screamed overhead, their missiles streaking toward the Garatha's massive form. The explosions bloomed like flowers against the creature's iron hide. Bright flashes that illuminated its ancient scars but left no new marks. The beast didn't even slow its advance. The city was in chaos. 3 million people trying to evacuate simultaneously, had overwhelmed every road and transportation system. Liu Wei could see families abandoned by traffic jams, carrying what possessions they could while children cried and the elderly struggled to keep up. The rational part of evacuation planning had collapsed under the sheer impossibility of moving so many people away from a threat that covered the horizon. Liu Wei activated a technique he had hoped never to use in populated areas. Drawing ki from the earth itself, he amplified his voice until it carried across the entire city like a thunderclap. People of Tianshan, do not flee to the highways. The creature cannot enter the old temple district. Seek shelter at the Temple of the Jade Buddha, the Ancestral Memorial Hall, and the Museum of Ancient Arts. These places are protected. His words echoed off buildings and mountains, reaching even those trapped in distant traffic jams. Many people looked around in confusion, unsure where this voice was coming from or whether to trust instructions that seemed to come from the air itself. But some remembered their grandparents' stories about places in the city that felt different, older, where the air itself seemed to hold echoes of ancient power. Streams of people began changing direction, heading for locations that tourism boards had marked as historically significant without understanding the deeper truth behind their importance. Liu Wei himself moved toward the advancing Garatha, weaving between abandoned vehicles and groups of fleeing civilians. Each step was precisely placed, his movement a perfect example of the celestial dragon style's principle of finding harmony, even in chaos. The beast was now close enough that Liu Wei could see individual details of its construction. The Garatha wasn't entirely biological. Ancient metallic implants were fused with its flesh, technological augmentations from a civilization that had existed before recorded history. Its creators had built it not just as a living creature, but as a weapon specifically designed to be unstoppable. Military units were establishing firing positions throughout the city, their heavy weapons aimed at the approaching Titan. Liu Wei could see Colonel Zhang coordinating the defense from a command post on a rooftop, his officers struggling to develop tactics for fighting something that existed outside all established doctrine. The Garatha's first step into the city proper crushed a shopping mall, its foot creating a crater where hundreds of people had shopped just hours earlier. The creature moved with surprising precision for something so massive, its ancient intelligence calculating the most efficient path of destruction. We reached a position 3 blocks ahead of the beast and began the ritual his ancestors had developed for this exact situation. The awakening of the inner dragon was not a technique taught to ordinary students. It required a practitioner to channel forces that could destroy an unprepared body, pushing human capability beyond normal limits by opening pathways that connected directly to the Earth's own energy. As qi flowed through his meridians at levels that would have killed a normal person, Liu Wei's appearance began to change. His movements became more fluid, his reflexes increased beyond human possibility, and an aura of energy became visible around him like heat shimmer in reverse. The Garatha noticed him. For the first time since its awakening, the massive creature paused. Its burning red eyes focused on the small human figure standing in its path, and something like recognition flickered in that ancient gaze. The beast remembered fighting humans like this one, remembered that not all prey was helpless. Liu Wei spoke in the old language, words that had been preserved since the first sealing. Ironhide Garatha, first of the Titan Guard, you wake to a world that has changed. Your masters are gone. Your purpose is ended. Return to your rest. The creature's response was a roar that shattered windows for miles around. It had no intention of returning to sleep. The Garatha's massive fist descended toward Liu Wei like a building falling from the sky. But the Kung Fu master was no longer where the creature expected him to be. Using the void step technique, Liu Wei moved between the spaces of reality itself, appearing behind the beast's hand as it crashed into the street. He began the 1,000 strikes of the dragon's wrath, his hands moving faster than the human eye could follow. Each strike was precisely placed, targeting pressure points that existed even on a creature this size. But instead of trying to cause immediate damage, Liu Wei was doing something more subtle, mapping the beast's energy flows and finding the weak points in its ancient construction. The Garatha spun with surprising speed, its backhand swipe missing Liu Wei by inches as he flowed like water around the attack. The displaced air from the creature's movement was enough to knock over cars, but Liu Wei rode the wind currents like a leaf that had learned to fight back. Military observers watching through scopes and cameras struggled to track the battle. Liu Wei's movements were too fast and fluid to follow clearly, while the Garatha's attacks created dust clouds and debris that obscured the action. What they could see defied everything they understood about physics and human limitation. Colonel Zhang's voice crackled over radio communications. "All units hold fire." "Repeat, hold fire. There's a civilian engaging the target." "Sir," came the response from a tank commander. "That's not a civilian. I don't know what that is." Liu Wei continued his assault, each strike teaching him more about his opponent's construction and vulnerabilities. The Garatha had been built to be indestructible, but its creators had made one crucial error. They had based its design on defeating the weapons and tactics of their own time. They had never imagined facing an enemy that could adapt and evolve techniques across 2,000 years. The beast caught Liu Wei with a glancing blow that sent him tumbling across 3 city blocks. For a moment, the watchers thought the fight was over, that the impossible had come to an end with the inevitable result. But Liu Wei rose from the rubble, his breathing controlled and his stance perfect. The impact that would have liquefied a normal human had been absorbed and redirected through techniques that turned destruction into fuel for greater power. "Now I understand you," Liu Wei said, speaking to the Garatha in words carried by Qi directly to the creature's consciousness. "You are not evil, merely programmed. Your creators built you to follow orders that no longer exist. Let me help you find peace." The real battle was about to begin. Liu Wei's next attack was unlike anything the Garatha had faced in its millennia of existence. Instead of trying to overpower the massive creature, he began using its own energy against it. The technique was called Dragon Turns the River, and it required perfect understanding of how force flowed through any structure, no matter how large or ancient. Each strike Liu Wei landed didn't try to damage the Garatha directly. Instead, his attacks redirected the creature's own movements, causing its massive limbs to work against each other. When the beast swung its right arm, Liu Wei's touch guided that motion into the path of its left leg. When it tried to regain balance, carefully placed pressure caused its corrective movements to become even more destabilizing. The Garatha roared in frustration, as its own body seemed to betray it. For something that had been built for perfect coordination and devastating efficiency, this sensation was more disturbing than pain. Its programming had never accounted for an enemy that could turn the creature's strengths into weaknesses. But Liu Wei wasn't finished learning. As he flowed around the beast's increasingly erratic attacks, he began to understand the deeper truth about the Titan beasts. They weren't just weapons from an ancient civilization. They were prisoners, locked into artificial personalities that had been overlaid on top of their original consciousness. Beneath the Garatha's programmed aggression, Liu Wei sensed something else: confusion, loneliness, and a deep exhaustion that came from being forced to fight for 2,000 years without rest. The creature's original nature had been buried under layers of command codes and behavioral modifications. This changed everything. Liu Wei abandoned his attack pattern and instead moved to the creature's massive head, using Qi-enhanced leaps to scale the Garatha like a mountain climber ascending a living cliff. The beast tried to swat him away, but Liu Wei's movements were too unpredictable, his small size making him nearly impossible to target effectively. When he reached the creature's skull, Liu Wei placed his palms against what appeared to be metallic implants embedded in the bone. These weren't just technological augmentations, they were control devices, mechanisms that had been forcing the Garatha to act against its true nature for millennia. "I see you," Liu Wei whispered, channeling his voice directly into the creature's consciousness through Qi manipulation. "Not the weapon they made you, but who you were before they changed you." The response nearly shattered Liu Wei's mind. The Garatha's original consciousness was vast and ancient, but also gentle. It had been a guardian creature, designed to protect rather than destroy. The civilization that had created the Titan, beasts had turned their own protectors into weapons through technological slavery. But removing the control implants would require a technique that Liu Wei had only read about in the oldest texts. The liberation of the bound spirit was considered one of the most dangerous methods in all of Kung Fu, because it required the practitioner to merge temporarily with their target's consciousness while using Qi to destroy technological integration that had been designed to be permanent. Military forces throughout the city watched in amazement as the battle suddenly stopped. The Garatha stood perfectly still, its massive head tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. Liu Wei appeared to be meditating on the creature's skull, his hands glowing with an energy that cameras couldn't quite capture properly. Colonel Zhang's voice was tight with tension as he spoke into his radio. All units maintain positions but do not engage. Something is happening that we don't understand. What was happening was the most difficult battle Liu Wei had ever fought, taking place not in the physical world, but in the realm of consciousness itself. Inside the Garatha's mind, he faced the accumulated programming of an extinct civilization, layers of command codes that had been designed to be unbreakable. But the programmers had made the same mistake as the Garatha's physical designers. They had assumed their enemies would fight using the same methods they understood. They had never encountered someone trained in techniques that treated consciousness as another form of energy to be manipulated and redirected. Liu Wei began dismantling the control systems from within, using mental techniques that combined meditation practices with combat applications. Each command code he unraveled revealed more of the Garatha's true personality, and with it came memories of the ancient civilization that had created the Titan beasts. The images that flowed through the connection were staggering. A highly advanced society that had achieved perfect harmony between technology and nature, creating living machines that served as both companions and protectors, gardens that spanned continents tended by creatures like the Garatha, who took joy in nurturing growth rather than causing destruction. But war had come to that peaceful world. Invaders from beyond the stars, beings whose very existence was antithetical to life. The civilization had turned their guardians into weapons out of desperation, corrupting everything they held sacred in a desperate attempt to survive. They had lost anyway. The invaders had been defeated not by the weaponized Titan beasts, but by the arrival of early humans who fought using techniques that seemed primitive but contained wisdom the advanced civilization had forgotten. Liu Wei understood now why his ancestors had developed kung fu. They hadn't been primitive humans learning to fight animals. They had been healers, working to free corrupted guardians and restore balance to a world that had been nearly destroyed by the war between civilizations. The final command code fell away like chains breaking, and the Garatha's true consciousness surged forward for the first time in 2 millennia. The creature's roar had changed completely, no longer expressing rage but wonder and gratitude. Its burning red eyes shifted to a warm golden color, and when it looked down at the humans throughout the city, there was no longer any hostility in its gaze. Liu Wei collapsed on the creature's head, the effort of the mental battle having drained him nearly to exhaustion. But he could feel the success of his work through the key connection he maintained with the Garatha. The creature was free, its original purpose restored. "Friends," the Garatha spoke, its voice now somehow conveying meaning directly to the minds of everyone who heard it. "I remember now. I was made to protect, to nurture, to guard life. I am sorry for the fear I have caused." The massive creature began to kneel carefully, lowering itself until Liu Wei could step safely to the ground. Around the city, millions of people watched in stunned silence as something that had moments before been an unstoppable destroyer became a gentle giant, expressing remorse for its actions. But Liu Wei's relief was short-lived. Through his enhanced senses, he could feel the other Titan beasts still trapped in their programming, still driven by ancient commands to destroy everything in their path. The venom serpent was approaching from the east, and the blade wolf was cutting a path of destruction from the south. The Garatha sensed them too. "My siblings still suffer as I suffered," it said sadly. "They cannot hear their true selves over the commands that bind them." Liu Wei nodded, though exhaustion made the simple movement difficult. "Then we must free them as well. But I cannot do it alone. The techniques required will kill me if I attempt them without help." The Garatha's golden eyes met his, and Liu Wei saw understanding there. "Then you shall have help, small teacher. We will heal my family together." The partnership between Liu Wei and the freed Garatha transformed what had seemed like an impossible situation into something resembling hope. The massive creature could move far faster than any human transportation, and its restored consciousness provided insights into the other Titan beasts that no ancient text could have contained. "The serpent will be the most dangerous," the Garatha explained as Liu Wei rested against its shoulder during their journey eastward. "Yas was always the most intelligent of us, but also the most sensitive. The corruption has been eating at her mind for longer than the rest. She may not wish to be freed. Liu Wei nodded, studying the ancient scroll he had brought from the temple. The techniques for healing a consciousness that had been poisoned by its own intelligence would require perfect precision. One mistake could drive the venom serpent completely insane rather than restoring her sanity. Behind them, Colonel Zhang's forces were struggling to coordinate an unprecedented situation. Half of the military was still preparing for battle against massive monsters, while the other half was trying to process the fact that one of those monsters was now apparently an ally carrying what appeared to be a monk toward the next threat. Radio communications had become surreal. Command, the large creature is maintaining a heading of 90 degrees east at approximately 40 kilometers per hour. The individual on its back appears to be meditation? Liu Wei was indeed meditating, but not in the peaceful way his students might recognize. He was preparing his consciousness for another merger, this time with a mind that had been deliberately poisoned against healing. The venom serpent's original programming had included psychological defenses, specifically designed to prevent the kind of liberation Liu Wei had performed on the Garatha. As they crested a ridge, the scope of the serpent's rampage became visible. The creature had been moving through populated areas, but rather than destroying them outright, it had been releasing clouds of toxins that killed everything organic in a perfect circle around its path. The pattern was too precise to be random. Yes was following some algorithmic instruction that treated the entire landscape as a contamination to be sterilized. She's trying to prepare the world for something, the Garatha said sadly. I can feel her consciousness from here, and it's trapped in a loop of commands related to planetary cleansing protocols. Liu Wei's jaw tightened as he understood the implications. The venom serpent wasn't just rampaging. It was systematically poisoning the environment, according to terraforming instructions that were 2,000 years out of date. If allowed to continue, Yes would render vast areas of the continent uninhabitable for centuries. The serpent herself was visible in the distance, her coils writhing through the sky in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Her scales reflected sunlight like a prism, creating rainbow effects that would have been beautiful if not for the death that followed in her wake. She was even larger than the Garatha, her length disappearing into the clouds. Can you communicate with her directly? Liu Wei asked. The Garatha tried, broadcasting thoughts on frequencies that had been used for communication between the Titan beasts in ancient times. The response was immediate and horrifying, a mental scream of pain and rage that nearly knocked Liu Wei unconscious even through his companion's protective filtering. She cannot hear us over her own suffering, the Garatha said, its voice heavy with grief. The poison she carries has been turned inward. She is dying from the toxins they forced her to produce. This changed Liu Wei's approach completely. He couldn't simply remove control programming if the serpent's consciousness was being destroyed by the very weapons her body had been forced to create. He would need to heal her from the inside out, using techniques that combined medical knowledge with advanced key manipulation. The Garatha brought them to a position directly beneath the serpent's flight path. Yes was moving in slow, deliberate spirals, releasing measured doses of venom that would spread according to wind patterns and atmospheric conditions. Her movement suggested a precision that could only come from technological calculation, rather than natural instinct. I need to get inside her body, Liu Wei said, the words sounding insane, even as he spoke them. The toxins are being generated by modified organs that are probably killing her as they operate. If I can reach those organs and shut them down. The Garatha understood immediately. You want me to get her attention while you board her like you boarded me. It was a plan that would have been rejected by any sane military strategist. But Liu Wei's training had prepared him for situations where conventional thinking was inadequate. He began the breathing exercises that would allow him to survive in an environment saturated with airborne poisons. The Garatha roared a challenge to its sister, calling Yis's attention down from her sterile flight patterns. The serpent's response was to dive directly at them, her massive head opening to reveal fangs that gleamed with venom potent enough to kill everything within miles. Liu Wei leaped from the Garatha's shoulder at the exact moment of the serpent's attack, using her diving momentum to carry him upward along her massive form. The toxic vapors surrounding Yes would have killed him instantly if not for the breathing, techniques that filtered poison at the cellular level. But as he scrambled along the serpent's scales, Liu Wei realized the full extent of the creature's corruption. The beautiful rainbow patterns he had seen from a distance were actually infected tissue, areas where the forced venom production had eaten through Yes's own body. She was literally dissolving from the inside, kept alive only by the technological augmentations that maintained her biological functions. Liu Wei found what he was looking for: a cluster of artificial organs grafted onto the serpent's spine, machinery that had been designed to convert her natural saliva into weapons-grade toxins. The devices were eating her alive, but they had also been built with safeguards that would kill her if they were simply removed. This would require the most delicate key work of Liu Wei's career. He needed to gradually replace the artificial organs, functions with his own energy, slowly weaning Yes's body away from the technology that was destroying her while keeping her alive during the transition. As he placed his hands on the corrupted machinery, Liu Wei felt the serpent's consciousness touch his own. Where the Garatha's mind had been buried under programming, Yes's awareness was fragmenting under constant pain. She knew she was dying, knew that every breath she took was poison, but the commands forcing her to continue were stronger than her own will to live. "Sister," Liu Wei whispered through their connection, "let me help you remember what it felt like to breathe clean air." The healing began, but so did the most dangerous phase of Liu Wei's mission. 2 Titan beasts were now free or being freed, but the most dangerous one was still approaching. And the blade wolf Fenrak had never been designed to be reasoned with. The healing of the venom serpent took 3 hours and nearly killed Liu Wei twice. Each corrupted organ had to be gradually replaced by key-maintained biological functions while keeping Yes conscious enough to participate in her own recovery. By the time the last artificial device had been safely removed, Liu Wei was operating on pure willpower, and the knowledge that failure would mean the death of everything he had sworn to protect. Yas's transformation was even more dramatic than the Garatha's had been. As the toxins cleared from her system, her scales shifted from the sickly rainbow patterns to a deep emerald green that seemed to glow with inner health. Her movements became fluid and graceful rather than mechanically precise, and when she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of millennia without the madness that had characterized her earlier communications. "Little healer," she said, lowering her massive head to where Liu Wei sat exhausted on her back. "I remember now what it was to love rather than destroy. The gardens we tended, the young we protected, the joy of creation rather than elimination. But their reunion was interrupted by seismic tremors that had nothing to do with earthquakes. The blade wolf Fenrak was approaching, and its method of travel was to simply carve a straight line through any obstacle in its path. Mountains, cities, rivers. Nothing slowed the creature's advance toward what its programming had identified as the source of the other Titan beast's malfunction. Fenrak was always different, the Garatha explained as the 3 of them converged on the wolf's projected path. "We were built to think, to adapt, to make decisions. Fenrak was built only to eliminate threats. Its consciousness is entirely subsumed by combat programming." Liu Wei studied his companions, seeing the concern in their ancient eyes. "You're saying it can't be reasoned with?" "Not in the way we were freed," Yes confirmed. Fenrak's original personality was entirely military. When they enhanced it with command programming, they didn't bury its consciousness, they amplified it. The creature we're about to face is exactly what it was designed to be: the perfect weapon. The implication sent a chill through Liu Wei despite his exhaustion. The blade wolf wasn't suffering from corruption like the others had been. It was functioning exactly as intended, which meant that appealing to its buried nature wouldn't work. Fenrak would need to be defeated rather than healed. They intercepted the wolf's path at a mountain pass that would have been considered impregnable by any conventional military force. Fenrak had carved through solid stone as if it were soft earth, leaving a tunnel behind it that stretched perfectly straight back to the horizon. The creature itself was unlike the other Titan beasts in almost every way. Where the Garatha and Yes were massive and imposing, Fenrak was lean and built for speed. Its body was covered in metallic fur that looked like flexible armor, and its limbs ended in claws that seemed to be made of some material that could cut through anything. Its eyes held no confusion or pain, only cold calculation and perfect focus. The wolf spotted them immediately and accelerated, moving faster than something that size should have been able to achieve. Liu Wei had perhaps 30 seconds to develop a strategy for fighting an opponent that had been specifically designed to be undefeatable. "Can you two contain it without being destroyed?" he asked quickly. "For a while," the Goratha said grimly, "but not for long." Fenrak was built to fight multiple Titan beasts simultaneously. Liu Wei's mind raced through possibilities. Traditional kung fu techniques wouldn't work on an enemy that had no consciousness to disrupt, and no buried nature to appeal to. But perhaps there was another approach, something that treated Fenrak not as a corrupted guardian but as what it truly was, a weapon that had outlived its purpose. "Don't try to defeat it," Liu Wei said as he slid down from Yes's back. "Just keep it busy. I need to reach its core programming, not to free it, but to update it." The battle between the three Titan beasts was unlike anything that had ever occurred on Earth. Fenrak moved like liquid lightning, its claws carving through stone and metal as it sought to eliminate what its programming identified as malfunctioning units. The Goratha met its charge with mountain-shaking impacts, while Yas used her length and agility to coil around the wolf's movements. But Liu Wei could see that his companions were losing. Fenrak had been built for exactly this scenario, and its combat efficiency was terrifyingly perfect. Each of its attacks found weak points in the other beast's defenses, while its own movements flowed seamlessly from offense to defense to elimination. Liu Wei activated the most dangerous technique in his arsenal, the soul's last strike. It was a method that channeled a practitioner's entire life force into a single moment of transcendent ability, but using it would kill him within minutes. He had hoped never to need it, but watching Fenrak systematically dismantling his companions made the choice clear. Power flowed through Liu Wei's body at levels that his physical form was never meant to contain. His movements became impossibly fast. His strength increased beyond human limitation, and his consciousness expanded until he could perceive the flow of energy through all three Titan beasts simultaneously. He leaped directly onto Fenrak's back while the wolf was engaged with the Goratha, moving so quickly that even the perfect weapon couldn't track him. Instead of trying to reach the creature's mind, Liu Wei drove his ki-enhanced consciousness directly into Fenrak's core programming. What he found there was both terrible and sad. Fenrak's consciousness hadn't been buried or corrupted. It had been refined into pure military function. The creature existed only to eliminate threats, and it was very, very good at its job. But that specialization was also its weakness. Liu Wei began inserting new parameters into Fenrak's programming, not trying to change its fundamental nature, but simply updating its target identification protocols. He showed the wolf that the threats it had been designed to eliminate were gone, that the war it had been built to fight was over, and that its continued operation was actually damaging the very things it had been created to protect. The process was like trying to reprogram a nuclear weapon while it was detonating, but Liu Wei's expanded consciousness could work at the speed of thought itself. Line by line, he updated Fenrak's mission parameters from eliminate all threats to protect all life. The change was immediate and dramatic. Fenrak stopped its attacks on the other Titan beasts and instead turned its perfect combat awareness toward assessing the actual state of the world around it. For the first time in 2,000 years, the wolf looked beyond its immediate tactical situation and saw the bigger picture. Mission parameters updated, Fenrak said, its voice carrying none of the warmth that characterized the other beasts but no longer holding the cold edge of pure aggression. New directives accepted. Current assignment, Guardian protocols activated. Liu Wei collapsed as the soul's last strike technique burned through the remainder of his life force. He had perhaps minutes left, but he had succeeded. All three Titan beasts were free, and the world would be safe from their rampage. But as his vision began to fade, Liu Wei felt something unexpected. The three massive creatures were surrounding him, and their combined consciousness was reaching out to his failing body with healing energy that dwarfed anything he had ever experienced. The healing power of the three Titan beasts flowed into Liu Wei like a river of pure life force, but it carried something more than mere energy. Through their combined consciousness, he experienced memories that predated human civilization, knowledge that revealed the true history of Earth and humanity's place in the cosmos. The original civilization that had created the Titan beasts hadn't been human, but they had been humanity's teachers. They had arrived on Earth millions of years ago, refugees from a cosmic war that had consumed their home galaxy. These beings had found a young planet with incredible potential and had dedicated themselves to nurturing the life that would eventually evolve into modern humans. The Titan beasts had been their companions and helpers, living tools that could shape continents and guide evolution itself. Under their guidance, Earth had become a paradise where technology and nature existed in perfect harmony. The creatures Liu Wei had just freed were among the last survivors of that golden age, but the war had followed them even here. The enemy that had destroyed their home galaxy had finally tracked them across the void, bringing weapons that could corrupt life itself and turn creation into destruction. The ancient teachers had been forced to make a terrible choice: corrupt their beloved guardians into weapons or watch everything they had built be destroyed. In the end, they had chosen a third option. They had encoded their knowledge and wisdom into the genetic structure of humanity's ancestors, creating a species that could eventually heal the damage they were about to cause. Then they had activated the sealing protocols that would lock away their corrupted guardians until the day when humans had evolved enough to free them. That day had come 2,000 years ago, when the first kung fu masters had developed techniques that could manipulate consciousness itself. But those masters had only partially succeeded, creating prisons rather than healing. It had taken Liu Wei's generation to finally complete the work that had been started millennia earlier. As the memories faded, Liu Wei found himself lying on soft grass rather than the rocky ground where he had collapsed. The three Titan beasts had carried him to a hidden valley that existed in a pocket dimension, connected to Earth but separate from it. This was one of the ancient sanctuary spaces, preserved since the time of the great teachers. "You're awake," Yes said gently, her massive head positioned so that Liu Wei could see her emerald eyes without straining his neck. "We thought we might have lost you despite our efforts." Liu Wei sat up slowly, surprised to find that he felt stronger than he had in years, rather than weakened by his ordeal. The healing the Titan beast had provided hadn't just saved his life, it had restored him to the peak of his physical and mental abilities. "How long was I unconscious?" 3 days, the Goratha replied. "Long enough for the human governments to finish processing what happened and decide how to proceed." Through the dimensional barrier that surrounded the valley, Liu Wei could see glimpses of the outside world. Military units were establishing permanent monitoring stations around the areas where the Titan beasts had first emerged. But they were clearly unsure how to classify creatures that had proven to be both incredibly dangerous and ultimately protective of human life. "The humans are afraid," Fenrak observed with its characteristic directness. "They understand that we are now aligned with their protection, but they cannot forget that we were recently threats to their existence." Liu Wei nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Humanity had just learned that they shared the planet with beings of immense power, and that their entire understanding of their own history was incomplete. It would take time for people to adjust to these new realities. "What will you do now?" he asked the three creatures. "What we were originally designed to do," the Goratha answered. "We will heal the damage that our rampage caused, and then we will resume our ancient role as guardians of life on this planet." Liu Wei watched as the three Titan beasts began to demonstrate what they meant. With delicate precision that seemed impossible given their massive size, they began restoring the landscape that had been damaged during their brief rampage. The Goratha's strength was used to rebuild rather than destroy, carefully reconstructing buildings and infrastructure. Hers, freed from her toxic burden, began producing healing compounds that would restore poisoned areas to full health. Even Fenrak contributed, using its perfect efficiency to organize the work with mathematical precision. But Liu Wei's role in this new world was just beginning. Through his connection with the Titan beasts, he had become something more than human, a bridge between the ancient wisdom and modern humanity. He could feel other sleepers stirring around the world, more guardians awakening as the planet's need for protection increased. Climate change, pollution, the extinction of species. These were all symptoms of the same problem that had nearly destroyed Earth 2 million years ago. Humanity had grown powerful enough to affect their entire world, but they had not yet learned the wisdom needed to use that power responsibly. The Titan beasts would help, but the real work would need to be done by humans themselves. Liu Wei understood that his next task would be to teach, to share the knowledge he had gained, not just about martial arts, but about humanity's true place in the cosmic community. As he prepared to return to the outside world, Liu Wei reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had thought he was simply a monastery guardian, preserving ancient traditions in a world that was rapidly leaving them behind. Instead, he had discovered that those traditions were humanity's inheritance, from teachers whose wisdom spanned galaxies. The three Titan beasts watched as Liu Wei walked toward the dimensional barrier that would return him to normal space. In the distance, he could see Colonel Zhang's command post, where military observers were trying to maintain surveillance on creatures whose true nature they couldn't begin to understand. "Will you be able to make them understand?" Ishus asked. Liu Wei smiled, feeling the weight of ancient knowledge balanced by the hope of a future where humanity could fulfill their true potential. "Understanding will come gradually, but for now it's enough that they know there are guardians watching over them. Beings who remember what this world was meant to be and will help us become what we were meant to become." He stepped through the barrier and back, into a world that had been forever changed by the awakening of ancient beasts and the courage of one man who had remembered that some battles could only be won through healing rather than destruction. The age of the Titan Guardians had begun again, and humanity's real education was just starting.